The light within the geode cathedral of Glyptos was eternal and unchanging, refracted through a million crystalline facets that formed the chamber's soaring walls and vaulted ceiling. It was a cold, pure light, born from the planet's heart and channeled upwards through the very foundations of the concordance. For millennia, this light had illuminated the deliberations of the High Council, a silent witness to the measured, logical progression of an empire that spanned 1,000 suns. But today, the light felt different. It seemed to cast longer, sharper shadows, and the silence that hung in the air was not the calm of consensus, but the brittle quiet of profound, gnawing uncertainty. High Observer Xylo stood at the heart of the chamber, his crystalline form a tower of placid blue, yet inside, his thoughts were a chaotic fracture. Before him, the data streams flowed in holographic ribbons of light, weaving a tapestry of information that was elegant, precise, and terrifyingly incomplete. The other observers of the council remained in their designated alcoves, their own forms shimmering with suppressed anxiety, a discordant symphony of colors from the deep violet of concern to the agitated crimson of indignation. They were the Glypt, masters of crystalline logic, a species that had long ago purged emotion in favor of perfect, calculated reason. Yet what they faced now defied reason. It was a void, a sudden and inexplicable absence of data where there should have been a torrent. The Cathar, a warrior species integrated into the concordance for their martial prowess and unwavering loyalty, had gone silent. Not just their primary fleet, but their entire home system. One moment, they were a predictable, if aggressive, vassal state, a useful tool for galactic stability. The next, they were a ghost. A single, final data burst had reached Glyptos before the silence fell, a message filled not with tactical reports or victory cries, but with something the Glypt translators struggled to define. A broadcast of pure, unadulterated terror, a psychic scream that had overloaded the concordance's deepest relays. The origin of the burst was traced to a previously insignificant yellow star system on the galaxy's outer rim, designated only by a string of survey coordinates. A system that housed a single, unremarkable world inhabited by a presapient organic species, a species they called humans. The Cathar acted without sanction, Observer Cygnus 7 stated, his voice a low, resonant chime that echoed in the vast chamber. His form was a deep, troubled purple. Their incursion into the Sol system was a violation of concordance protocols. They were tasked with observation, not engagement. To strike a level 4 developing world is an act of barbarism. Barbarism is the Cathar's nature, Cygnus 7, countered Observer Lyra 3, her sharp, crimson form glittering with impatience. We integrated them for that very reason. They are our sword, and a sword is meant to strike. The question is not why they struck, but what struck back. A murmur of agreement, a subtle shift in the ambient light as the observers resonated with the thought. This was the crux of their fear. The Cathar were not subtle. Their fleets were brutal instruments of overwhelming force, designed to shatter planets and incinerate civilizations. For their entire armada to be silenced in the act of assaulting a world of primitive bipeds who had barely mastered controlled fission was not just improbable. It was a violation of the known laws of physics. The Glypt had run 1,000 simulations. In every one, the human world, Earth, was scoured to its molten core within a single rotation. In every one, the Cathar fleet reported overwhelming victory. Reality had refused to conform to their logic. High Observer Xylo let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the unknown to press down upon the council. He was the oldest among them, his crystalline structure showing the faint, microscopic fractures of eons. He had seen the rise and fall of empires, had witnessed the birth of stars and the heat death of forgotten civilizations. He had learned that the greatest threat was never the known enemy, but the unquantifiable variable, and these humans were the most significant variable he had ever encountered. Our long-range observations of the Sol system show nothing, Xylo finally spoke, his voice the sound of shifting continents, slow and heavy with authority. No debris fields, no residual weapon signatures, no radiation blooms consistent with planetary bombardment or fleet-scale engagement. The Cathar fleet is simply. The human world remains, its biosphere intact, its energy output stable. It is as if the Cathar were never there. He paused, letting the impossible statement settle. And since the event, the entire Sol system has been enveloped in a field of placidity, a containment shell of unimaginable subtlety. It does not repel or destroy. It simply calms, NEP. Robe we send across its perimeter has its motive systems gently powered down. Any communication attempt is met with a signal that is not a jamming frequency, but a carrier wave of pure mathematical silence. Observer Lyra pulsed with a sharp, aggressive light. A cage has been built around them or they have built it themselves. Either possibility is an act of war. This, humanity, has somehow neutralized a concordance fleet. They have sequestered a galactic sector. They must be reclassified as a level 1 threat. We should dispatch the Grand Armada. We must understand the nature of this weapon they have deployed. A weapon that leaves no trace? Cygnus 7 countered, his violet hue deepening. A cage that does not harm? You speak of war, Lyra 3, but the evidence does not support a conclusion of aggression. It suggests a response of such profound technological superiority that it operates outside our understanding of conflict. To send the Grand Armada would be to risk our greatest military asset against an enemy whose capabilities we cannot even begin to model. Xylo turned his focus to a younger observer, Orion 1, whose form was a pale, shimmering silver of intellectual curiosity. Orion 1, you were the one who compiled the initial survey data on the humans. Your report classified them as non-threatening, pre-industrial, fractured by tribal conflicts, consumed by their own internal pathologies. You noted their capacity for paradoxical behavior, great art and great cruelty, profound philosophy and base superstition. Your final assessment was that they would self-annihilate within a few of their centuries. Reevaluate. The silver observer seemed to shrink under the weight of Xylo's gaze. High observer, the data was conclusive. Their radio transmissions were a cacophony of primitive entertainment and internecine squabbles. Their spacefaring technology was rudimentary, limited to their own system and reliant on chemical propellants. There was no indication, no hint of unified purpose, let alone technology on this scale. They broadcast their every weakness, their every fear into the void. They seemed broken, a species at war with itself. And yet they are not, Xylo stated, his voice resonating with finality. They are unified now. The cacophony from their world has ceased. Since the Cathar incursion, their planetary transmissions have resolved into a single, coherent signal. A simple, repeating mathematical sequence. Not a message, not a threat. An announcement. It is the frequency of a system that is awake, aware, and waiting. A cold dread, an illogical, emotional ghost, seeped into the chamber. The Glypt had always prided themselves on their omniscience within their sphere of influence. They were the galaxy's librarians, its historians, its quiet custodians. They had observed the humans for centuries, cataloging them as one might catalog a peculiar mold growing in a forgotten corner of the universe. They had seen their petty wars, their fleeting triumphs, their self-destructive tendencies, and had filed them away as a future footnote in the galactic record. They had never considered that the humans might be observing them in return. There is another possibility, Cygnus 7 chimed, his tone hesitant. One that our logic models resist, but which we cannot dismiss. The Cathar were a deeply spiritual, if savage, people. They spoke of legends, of old gods of war that slumbered in the void. They believed that to awaken such a being was the ultimate glory. Perhaps what they found in the Sol system was not a primitive species. Lyra flashed a derisive red. Mythology, superstition. We are the Glypt, Cygnus 7. We do not entertain the fantasies of lesser races. There is a technological explanation. A hidden power, a forgotten protectorate, a sentinel weapon from a precursor race. These are logical possibilities. Slumbering gods is not. But Xylo felt a tremor run through his own crystalline being, a resonance with the old, illogical fear. The Cathar's final, terrified broadcast had not been words. It had been a feeling. The feeling of a child who had kicked open the door to a sacred tomb and found that the effigy on the sarcophagus was stirring. We have operated on an assumption, Xylo said, his voice silencing all debate. We assumed that a species' technological advancement would be broadcast with pride. We expected energy signatures, stellar engineering, the loud proclamations of a rising power. We saw none, and so we judged them primitive. We have judged a silent ocean by its placid surface, ignoring the leviathans that might dwell in its unplumbed depths. He focused the main data stream, magnifying the image of the Sol system. The blue planet Earth hung in the void, serene and beautiful. We have kicked the temple door. Now we will listen for the footsteps of the god within. The waiting was an agony of logic. For weeks, the concordance held its breath. Fleets were rerouted. Borders were hardened. The greatest minds of the Glypt Empire were focused on the silent, placid enigma of the Sol system. They analyzed every photon, every graviton, every neutrino that emanated from the human sphere of influence. They found nothing but perfect, unnerving peace. The mathematical signal from Earth continued its placid broadcast, a steady, rhythmic pulse that was maddening in its simplicity. It was like listening to the slow, deep breathing of a sleeping giant. Then one day, the placidity field around the Sol system dissolved. It did not collapse or fail. It simply retracted, folding back into itself with a grace that defied physics. In its place, a single vessel emerged, crossing the system's edge at a calm, deliberate sublight velocity. The alert klaxons in the geode cathedral were silent, replaced by a single, low chime of ultimate priority. Every observer was present, their forms rigid with anticipation. The data streams flowed, displaying the intruder in breathtaking detail. It was not a warship. There were no weapon emplacements, no visible shield emitters, no aggressive lines or tactical plating. The ship was a smooth, obsidian spindle, a teardrop of impossible blackness that seemed to drink the light of the nearby stars. Its energy signature was almost non-existent, a cold, flat line against the background radiation of space. It moved with a silent, inexorable grace, not like a machine but like a creature of the void. It was heading directly for Glyptos. "It is hailing us," an analyst chimed, his voice tight with tension. "Broadcasting on all concordance diplomatic frequencies, it is an invitation." Lyra's crimson form burned with barely contained aggression. "A trick, a Trojan horse, we must destroy it before it reaches the capital." "Destroy it with what, Lyra 3? Cygnus 7 countered, his own form a pale, worried lavender. "It has crossed our outer defense perimeter without triggering a single alarm. Its drive signature is something we cannot even classify. It is not warping space-time, nor is it traversing a wormhole. It appears to be convincing space to allow it passage. To attack it would be to throw stones at a shadow." Xylo raised a hand, a gesture of pure, monolithic authority. "We will receive them. Open a channel. Let us finally hear the voice of the species that has rendered a Cathar fleet to dust and silence." The main hololith in the chamber shimmered, resolving not into a view screen, but into a full, three-dimensional representation of the human vessel's command deck. The technology was seamless, a perfect projection of light and sound that was decades, perhaps centuries, ahead of Glyp telepresence. The interior was as Spartan and elegant as the exterior. The walls were a soft, matte gray, emitting a gentle, indirect light. There were no visible controls, no frantic crew members, no flashing consoles. There was only a single figure standing in the center of the room. A human, a female. She was small by Glypt standards, her form delicate and fragile. She wore a simple, dark blue uniform devoid of rank or insignia. Her hair was dark, pulled back from a face that was pale and composed. Her eyes, however, were what held the observers captive. They were a deep, clear gray, and they held an ancient, weary calm. There was no fear in them, no anger, no arrogance. There was only a profound, unshakable stillness. She looked directly at Xylo's projection, as if she could see every observer in the geode cathedral. "This is Ambassador Eva Rostova of the Terran Unity," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and resonated with a quiet authority that belied her simple appearance. The Glyp translation matrix worked perfectly, conveying not just the words, but the subtle, melancholic tone beneath them. "I speak for humanity. We have come to discuss the unsanctioned incursion into our sovereign space and the desecration of the world you have designated Sol 3A. We call it Epitaph." The name sent a ripple of confusion through the council. Epitaph, a monument to the dead. Xylo's voice was a low rumble. "Ambassador Rostova." "I am High Observer Xylo of the Glypt Concordance. We acknowledge your presence. Your vessel's capabilities are unexpected, as was the outcome of the Cathar fleet's expedition." Rostova gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "The Cathar fleet was not destroyed, it was pacified, contained. The crews are unharmed, held in biodynamic stasis. Their actions were those of a primitive, driven by unchecked aggression. To answer barbarism with barbarism is to validate it. That is not the human way." "Not anymore." Lyra could not contain her indignation. "Pacified? You neutralized an entire battle group of the Concordance's finest warriors. You have committed an act of war, and you speak to us of peace." The ambassador's gaze shifted to Lyra 3's crimson, agitated form. Her expression did not change, but the air in the geode cathedral grew colder. "What you call worry? Ors we call children lashing out in the dark. They came to a place of great sorrow, a world we set aside as a memorial, and they attempted to burn it. They did not understand what they were doing, what ground they were treading upon. They kicked open the door to a temple. We did not invite them in." Xylo felt a profound chill. Cygnus 7's words echoed in his mind, slumbering God's asterisk. "This world epitaph," Xylo pressed, his voice careful. "Our records show it is your homeworld, Earth." "Why do you call it by such a name?" Ambassador Rostova's gaze returned to him. For the first time, a flicker of something ancient and terrible passed through her eyes, a grief so vast it was geological. "It is our homeworld, yes, but it is also our greatest shame. It is the tomb of our own past. The world you saw, the one your probes cataloged for centuries, was a lie, a carefully maintained illusion." She raised a hand, and the holographic projection around her shifted. The serene image of Earth, the blue and white marble, dissolved. It was replaced by a scarred, wounded planet. The continents were recognizable, but they were pockmarked with wounds that glowed with the faint, deadly light of forgotten energies. Ruined cities, vast and sprawling, lay like skeletons across the land. The oceans were dark, and great geometric scars ran across the seabed, visible even from orbit. It was a world that had been savaged by a war of unimaginable scale. For millennia, Rostova continued, her voice a low, somber elegy, humanity was not unified. We were a storm of ideologies, of tribes, of nations. We turned our genius for creation into a genius for destruction. We forged weapons that could unmake stars. We waged a war against ourselves that shattered our world, poisoned our genome, and pushed us to the very brink of extinction. We were not slumbering, high observer. We were screaming. The observers were silent, stunned. Their neat, logical classification of humanity as a pre-industrial fractured society was a laughable understatement. They had not been observing primitives squabbling over land. They had been observing the traumatized survivors of a near apocalypse, living in the ruins of a civilization so advanced it had almost annihilated itself. The survivors, Rostova said, her voice soft but firm, vowed that it would never happen again. We dismantled the last of our great weapons. We gathered our remaining technology, our deepest knowledge, and we hid it. We turned inward, focusing all our energy on healing our world and our souls. We created a new philosophy, a new way of being built on a foundation of profound restraint. We learned that true power is not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom not to. We became quiet. We put our gods of war to sleep and built a temple of memory around them, a temple called Epitaph. We wanted to be left alone in our long penance. Her gaze hardened slightly. The Cathar did not respect our solitude. They came to that holy place, that graveyard of a billion sins, and they prepared to commit another. They mistook our silence for weakness, our peace for primitivism. They raised their hands to strike a monument to the cost of war. The projection shifted again. This time, it showed the Cathar fleet as it had entered the Sol system. A swarm of brutal, angular ships, bristling with energy cannons. They formed an orbital bombardment pattern around the quiet Earth. And then the human response. It was not a fleet of ships, it was something else. From the dark side of Earth's moon, a presence emerged, not a solid object, but a wave of shimmering, silvery light, a cohesive field of pure energy that expanded at impossible speeds. It did not fire projectiles. It did not emit radiation. It simply passed through the Cathar fleet. The glipped observers watched, their logical minds struggling to process the visual data. As the silver wave touched each Cathar ship, the vessel came apart. Not in an explosion, but in a clean, silent, and terrifyingly precise deconstruction. Armor plates separated, engine cores were gently quenched, weapon systems were disassembled into their component parts. It was as if a divine watchmaker were taking apart 1,000 timepieces simultaneously. Life signs of the Cathar crews flickered, and then stabilized as their bodies were instantly encased in stasis fields, their ships dismantled around them atom by atom. The entire process took less than a minute. The Cathar fleet, a force that could have cracked a continent, was reduced to a cloud of inert, perfectly sorted raw materials and a collection of sleeping crews. The chamber was filled with a silence so profound it was a physical weight. Lyra 3's crimson light had faded to a dull, shocked pink. Cygnus 7 was a deep, awestruck indigo. What they had just witnessed was not war. It was pest control. It was the effortless, almost indifferent application of a power so absolute it rendered the very concept of conventional conflict meaningless. Humanity had not fought the Cathar. They had tidied them away. That, Ambassador Rostova said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, was the gentlest response we could muster. It was a demonstration of our resolve, not our power. You cannot comprehend our power, High Observer, because we have spent the last 10,000 years making sure we never have to use it again. We are not a race of warriors. We are a race of repentant gods who live in constant fear of their own nature. High Observer Xylo felt the foundations of his millennia-long worldview crack. The Glypt had built an empire on the principles of observable data, predictable patterns, and logical escalation. Humanity was none of those things. They were a paradox, a species that possessed the power to unmake reality, yet chose to live in quiet contemplation of its own past failures. They were not an enemy to be fought. They were a philosophical constant that the Concordance had failed to account for. What do you want from us?" Xylo asked, the question feeling small and inadequate in the face of such a revelation. "Understanding," Rostova replied simply. "And an answer, the Cathar did not act alone. Their aggression was amplified, unnatural. We have analyzed their flight recorders, their crew's neural logs. They were being driven by an external influence, a signal." a mimetic virus that preys on species with a predisposition for conflict, turning their natural aggression into a suicidal, fanatical rage. It guided them to our system. It pushed them to attack. She paused, and the weight of her next words fell upon the geode cathedral like a shroud. We have been monitoring this signal for centuries. It is ancient, patient, and it does not originate from within our galaxy. It is a whisper from the void between galaxies, and it is growing stronger. It is a recruitment beacon. The Cathar were not the first to hear its call, and they will not be the last. The scale of the situation suddenly expanded from a regional conflict to something infinitely larger and more terrifying. The Cathar were not villains, they were victims. And humanity had not been hiding from the galaxy. They had been standing watch. You knew, Xylo breathed, a dawning horror and understanding washing over him. Your isolation was not penance, it was a vigil. Penance and vigil are two sides of the same coin, Rostova corrected gently. We watch for the storm because we know better than any other species what devastation a storm can bring. We had hoped to face it alone when it finally arrived, to spare the rest of the galaxy from the kind of war we once waged upon ourselves. But the Cathar's actions have forced our hand. Your concordance is now involved. The temple door has been kicked open, and we can no longer afford to stand watch in silence. Her expression, for the first time, softened with something that looked like empathy or perhaps pity. High Observer Xylo, your concordance is built on logic and order, but the universe is not always logical. There are things in the great dark that are older than reason, things that feed on chaos. An entity is coming. An entity that seeks to turn this entire galaxy into an instrument of its own will, a screaming chorus of war and destruction. We have been preparing. The Cathar attack was merely the first faint tremor of the coming earthquake. Xylo looked around the chamber at the other observers. Their crystalline forms, once so certain and proud, now seemed fragile, their light dimmed by a fear that transcended logic. They had been debating territorial rights and diplomatic protocols while a cosmic predator was turning one of their own member species into a weapon. They had been children playing with stones on the beach, oblivious to the rising tide. You are offering an alliance, Xylo stated, the words feeling heavy and momentous. We are stating a fact, Rostova corrected. An alliance is now a necessity for mutual survival. We have the knowledge and the means to fight this threat. You have the infrastructure, the reach, and a network of worlds that will need to be protected or fortified. We cannot allow this consuming hunger, to turn the peoples of this galaxy against one another as we once turned against ourselves. We will not allow our past to become this galaxy's future. The human ambassador fell silent, her duty done. The proposal hung in the air, a choice of such magnitude it would define the future of all life in the galaxy. On one hand, there was the known order of the concordance, a system of logic that had just been proven catastrophically incomplete. On the other, there was an alliance with a species of unimaginable power, a race of slumbering war gods who were, by their own admission, their own worst enemy. To trust them was a leap of faith, a betrayal of the crystalline logic that had guided the Glypt for eons. But not to trust them. As to face the coming darkness alone. Xylo's gaze drifted from the ambassador's calm, waiting face to the holographic star chart that dominated the center of the chamber. He no longer saw a collection of systems to be cataloged and managed. He saw a fragile ecosystem of light and life, surrounded by an infinite, patient darkness. The humans were not an anomaly. They were the galaxy's immune system, a painful, self-inflicted antibody born from a fever that had almost killed them, now awakened to fight a far greater infection. His own form began to glow, a soft, resolute blue light that pushed back against the chamber's shadows. He turned his gaze to the other observers, and one by one, their own lights began to answer his, shifting from the colors of fear and uncertainty to the steady, clear hues of resolve. Crimson of Lyra III's aggression softened into a deep, thoughtful ruby. The violet of Cygnus VII's caution brightened into a noble amethyst. Ambassador Rostova, High Observer Xylo said, his voice no longer the rumble of a judge but the clear, ringing tone of a partner. The Glypt Concordance accepts the reality of your assessment. The principles of crystalline logic dictate that when faced with new data that invalidates all previous models, a new model must be created. You are our new model. He made a gesture, and the Concordance's most sacred symbol, a perfectly interlocking lattice of light, appeared in the space between him and the human ambassador. We will stand with you. We will unite our logic with your wisdom. The Cathar will be brought out of stasis and informed of the true nature of their actions. They are warriors. When they learn they were used as pawns, their rage will be a tool we can direct at the true enemy. Eva Rostova inclined her head, a gesture of solemn acknowledgement. The silent vigil is over, High Observer. The work begins. The projection of the human vessel's bridge faded, leaving the observers alone once more in the eternal light of the geode cathedral. But the light was no longer cold. It felt different now, imbued with a new purpose. The silence that returned was not one of fear, but of profound, sober determination. Xylo stood for a long time, contemplating the star chart. The galaxy looked the same, but he saw it with new eyes. He saw the faint, almost invisible threads of the ancient, corrupting signal, a web of malice spreading from the intergalactic void. He saw the Cathar system, now a patient waiting to be cured rather than a criminal to be punished. And he saw the Sol system, the quiet, unassuming star that housed the galaxy's most terrifying and hopeful paradox. The temple door had been kicked open. The gods within were not vengeful, but they were awake. And Xylo, for the first time in 10,000 years, felt a flicker of something his people had long ago abandoned, something that was not derived from logic, but from a deeper, more primal place. It was the terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly necessary feeling of hope. The long, quiet peace of the galaxy was over. A greater war than any had ever imagined was coming, and at the heart of the storm would stand the calm, sad-eyed children of Earth, the repentant gods who had already seen the end of a world and had sworn, with all their terrible power, never to let it happen again.